made this one really hard. I'm sorry, everybody. Dystopian crossed your mind a lot in the past few years? Even looking at my own content, Kadama, I'm like, wow. Who is this person? I think everyone was
Okay.
survival mode, and I know the cost of living is very tough right now for a lot of people. And it's still very tough and people are in survival mode, but I feel like people want a long-term change. I feel like people want a authentic change. I feel like people are fed up of being sold dreams and sold lifestyles and perfect Instagram lives. I was gonna delete my Instagram at one point. Just let it sit there until you're ready to delete the content and start again. It makes a lot of sense. I hope so. I don't know. I know everyone has their own beliefs. And religion and spirituality is very personal. But I do feel at the end of the day, if we can all just care and support ourselves and support each other, it's all gonna be alright. Hey Mum, why are you laughing at me, Mum? Did you hit the wrong emote? Thank you for the 82 months, Mum. Literally. And then as a content creator, I'll be like, do I need to do this? Is this what I need to be doing to be keeping up with other content creators? Is this what I need to do to make an income? Is this what I need to do? And I'm like, no, why would you? You can be, you don't have to be like that. You don't have to, like, constantly chasing, it's exhausting. I feel like it's exhausting. Mentally and physically exhausting. Thank you, Julie. Anyway, I'll stop prattling on. I really like trees. That's my conclusion of all of this. I like trees. Let's do frog sounds. Drive safely, Ryan Jack. Catch you later. Yeah, sponsorships are very different.
I think it's supposed to be in both. It'll be in voice, but I think also there's a live stream with
I'm not a huge
closed
contributor.
captioning
I
as
don't
well.
get huge amounts of sponsorship. Yet I still turn down some because they're not right. Whereas I do feel like there's a lot of pressure on the new content creators to take everything. And it's like, you don't really like this face cream, do you? You'll be using a different face cream next week. Hey Apple. Oh, you made the Lego flowers. Do they look good? Were you tired? Is that tired? Your fingers ache. I bought my mum some of those Lego flower bouquets for Christmas. Because I really enjoyed the little plum ones. Much easier. Okay, shall we start the tingle takeover? You have to send me a picture, Mum. So, in a minute, I will switch on a bunch of channel point redemptions.
No, no one is talking yet. I'm testing just so you can hear me. We're just, I think, waiting a minute or two for folks to show up, and then we'll start in a minute or two. So good, good. Glad my voice sounds fine. One side benefit of COVID was getting one of those nice microphones, right?
Let me just do this.
Yes, it is a paradox. Thank you. Thank you, Gentle.
See.
You know, people hear me when I turn on my microphone, and I didn't have it on. So I was going along quite normally without people hearing me. So my apologies for that. But as I said before, mainly to myself, that my name is Meryl McBride, and I will be your host today. Uh, we want to welcome you to this installment of our VWEC Expert Series, in which we ask educational professionals to share their experiences and their insights into ways that virtual worlds can be used to engage students. I am pleased to introduce today's guest presenter, Tom Bukowski in SL, or Tom Boellstorff in the physical world, who will share with us his research into Mattel's Intellivision project of the early 1980s. Tom is a professor of anthropology at at the University of California, Irvine. Many of us know him for his seminal work on social virtual worlds, particularly his 2008 book, revised in 2015, on coming of age in Second Life. I would be remiss if I failed, additionally, to acknowledge his substantial work on gaming in general and on LGBT culture in Southeast Asia, the latter reflecting his research versatility. Oh, yes, his next stop, research focusing on climate. Tom has been active in Second Life for nearly 20 years. Please be advised that this presentation will be recorded and streamed on YouTube. You can find the stream at the address that we will insert into local chat. You feel free, please, feel free to post questions to chat during his talk, and I will collect them for him to answer at the end of the session. VWEC is committed to accessibility. If text will help you enjoy today's presentation, please click the sign at the front of the stage and you will get directions to our YouTube stream, which will help you with captions for all who are speaking today. We hope this is a help. Now, without any further a delay, and with the hope that I will not forget to turn on my microphone again, let me turn the stage over to Tom Boellstorff. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much. And once again, just checking, everyone can hear me okay? I sound I sound okay? Good. Thank you. Thank you. Um, so thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me. I've been to some of the talks that you've done in this series, and you're an amazing group, and I love doing stuff with this group, and it's just been really wonderful any chance to be with you all. And so, yeah, as many of you know, June will be in June. I'll have my 20th birthday in Second Life, which is hard to believe. And I've done lots of different research projects with many of you in this room over the years. I know, Trap, we're all aging, but our avatars are beautiful, right? And our older bodies are beautiful too, actually. And as you just heard, and I've done stuff, during COVID, and I did stuff around education, teaching classes in Second Life. I had Anteater Island, and I'm just beginning a new project. That's right, I can almost drink. Just beginning a new project about virtual worlds and climate change. And some of you in the room know a little bit about that. It's just starting, and if you're interested in that, please IM me or email me. Let me right now, before I forget, put my email in, because I want to get people involved in that. I plan on doing the next 5 or 10 years of my life focusing on that. But what I'm going to talk about today is the Intellivision video game system. And because this is a series about education, about how people learned how to design video games at the very beginning. So I am so lucky with the job that I have that my department and university supports me in doing basically anything that I want to do, which is why some of you might ask, Tom, you're a professor of anthropology. Why are you talking about a history book from 40 years ago with Intellivision? And the answer is, I had coffee one day with another professor, Braxton, who's a good friend of mine now. This was like 8 years ago, and we realized we both grew up playing the Intellivision video game system and got really excited about that, and realized no one had ever done a good history of this system. And so we thus began a journey where we have written this book over the last 8 years, in between teaching and other things that we've both been doing. And it is coming out this fall from MIT Press, which is a very good press, Massachusetts Institute of Technology Press, in a series they do looking at what's called platform studies, where you study something like a video game system from the technical side, the social side, advertising, everything. And this has been the biggest thing I've ever done. I hope I never do something so big again. I think I'd have to check. I think for Coming of Age in Second Life, the book that Meryl mentioned, I think I did 40 interviews. We did 150 interviews for this. It was just gigantic. And we got about 20,000 pages of documents, including computer code. And we were so lucky because these people who created this system in the 1980s, some have passed, but the ones who are still around are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And they were so eager to talk and share documents with us, share memories, share information. We were so lucky. And it is this kind of near history where, compared to doing something from 200 years ago where everyone that you want to talk about has passed on, here we were able to learn a lot from people. And one amazing thing that we could do as a method, just for those of you who are interested in methods and interested in history, is because we found all these documents, we could show people documents before we'd interview them. And many times, because it was 40 years ago, they would say they didn't remember much, but when we showed them something they had written back then, the memories would come flooding back, and we'd get really cool, information. So Intellivision is what this book is about. And let me first just briefly tell you a little bit about Intellivision, and then I'm going to do the education, piece that is the focus for today. So Intellivision was a video game system. It was a big competitor to Atari, if you know what that is, and ColecoVision. It was sold mainly between 1980, really, but it got started around 78 until 1984 when the famous video game crash happened. And unlike Atari, Intellivision, like the name says, they were trying to make it intelligent. And that included a lot of things about how the system was designed, including these hand controllers, which, if you look at them, look like telephones almost. They have a 12-button keypad, a disc. They have little side buttons that you can't really see from that image. And they had these plastic overlays that you could slide onto that keypad that would customize the hand controller for each game. Atari had nothing like this. So even this beginning piece of it, you can see it was trying to sort of make video games and gaming intelligent. In fact, one thing we do in this book is talk about how it's almost an alternative history of artificial intelligence, right? They were trying to do this with very limited, abilities back then. Very briefly, because I'm going to focus on education for this talk, very briefly, under the hood, this is a drawing of how Intellivision worked by one of the people who created it, David Chandler, who I'll mention in a second. It used a very interesting central processing unit that was based on 10-bit decals instead of 8-bit bytes. Very unique. I could talk later about what that meant. It also had this special chip called the STIC, the Standard Television Interface Chip, also designed by this company, General Instrument. And that would do things about helping draw things on the TV screen that like Atari couldn't do in the same way because of this STIC chip. It was also one of the first video game systems to have a built-in operating system that was called the exec. And that would do things like, if you were playing baseball, you could say, I hit the baseball here at the beginning, and the ball needs to end up at third base. And the exec could figure out the path. It would draw the path. So it reduced the amount of code that you had to have on a cartridge. And that's good because the cartridges originally were all 4K. And it's 4KD, not KB, because it's kilodecals, not kilobytes. To compare, a smartphone nowadays, a lot of them are 512 gig. That would be like 100 million of these cartridges, just to give you an idea of how limited the memory was 40 years ago. 4K. The whole game had to fit in 4K. You could only have up to 8 moving objects, but that was more than Atari. It had 3 channels of sound. I could talk a lot more about that, but I'm not going to because, today I'm focusing on the education piece. But some of this technical stuff will show up because it's part of what people had to deal with. So Intellivision was part of what's called the second generation of video game systems. The first generation was things like Pong, if you knew what Pong was, or some things like the Magnavox Odyssey, where all of the games that you could play were built into the machine, right? The second generation, in some ways, was the most important shift because the big thing about then was for the first time you had cartridges. So you could sell a video game system and buy it, and 6 months or 3 months or a year later, buy new games for it. That was a big shift, right? The second generation, that was the big shift. So it wasn't just about like speed. The Fairchild Channel F was one of the first second generation systems, absolutely. The Bally Astrocade, the Fairchild Channel F, Atari, ColecoVision, Intellivision, these are the main second generation systems. And the Fairchild Channel F was actually the first of them all to hit the market. And during this time, video game production really exploded, and it was mostly US based. So this is before Sega, Nintendo, all those folks entered the market. So it was a very US based time. And the other big thing going on at the time was the arcade, like you see from this video game magazine from the day. Is a big thing that was going on was this idea of domesticating video games, bringing them home. Because back then, arcades was where a lot of stuff was happening, right? And so I grew up in the arcades. I lived in the arcades when I was a teenager. And so this idea of bringing video games home, and what that meant, that like a video game could take an hour to play for the first time, right? Because if you're based on quarters, you don't want people to play too long, right? So Atari was a company that started out doing, games, and some of these other companies were like that. Intellivision was created by Mattel. There was a movie you might have seen recently, right? Barbie. Mattel, this toy company, founded in 1944, So a really interesting part of this story is how did toys impact the history of video games? And that's an interesting connection because actually, like Coleco was a toy company that did ColecoVision. There are some interesting connections in that space. And in the case of Mattel, they pioneered television commercials when they advertised for the Mickey Mouse Club in 1955. It was going to cost them, it cost them $500,000, which is about what the company was worth back then. It was founded by Ruth and her husband, Elliot. Ruth is actually in the Barbie movie. And another guy, Matt, who they bought out after about 5 years. But Matt and Elliot is where Mattel comes from. Matt L. Ruth didn't make it into the name, surprise, surprise. But Ruth was one of the earliest CEOs, female CEOs of a big company. She was an amazing businesswoman. And in 1959, she pioneered Barbie, which is named after her daughter, Barbara. And, the story goes that she was in Switzerland and her daughter wanted this doll called a Lily doll, and they bought it. And then they went to another store down the street and there was a Lily doll with a different dress, like a blue dress. And Barbara really wanted that dress. And Ruth Handler asked the clerk, "Can I get that dress?" And the clerk looked at her with disdain and said, "If you want the dress, you have to buy the doll, woman. What are you thinking?" And a light bulb went off in her head. Wait a second. Why make people buy the doll over and over again? You could just sell the clothes, right? It's like the razor blade model. They talked about that back then. That's what led to the big success of Barbie. And this is interesting because when you think about it, with the second generation, video game cartridges where you can buy more video games, that is a razor blade model as well, right? So they were already thinking in those terms of a razor blade model with Barbie, even before the second generation. And they also pioneered the use of technology in toys. One of the big designers of Barbie was Jack Ryan, who had been working on the Hawk missile system for the military industrial company Raytheon. And many of the early people involved, as you'll see, were connected to technology and even military technology. And they pioneered toys like Chatty Cathy that had a built-in disc thing you pull and it would give, it would talk and give voice. One of the big leaders in that was this guy, Richard Chang, who joined the company in 1964 and led this project to create this organ called the Optagon that used these laser discs, basically optical discs, way ahead of its time. It was a failure in the market. It was very complex and expensive, but they were trying to push things in terms of technology, even back then. And even despite this not working out, Chang rose up in Mattel to become the director of this group called Preliminary Design, the funny farm. That was where you would put all these inventors together to come up with cool new toy ideas. And they were interested in all the stuff that was going on in the 70s around technology. And in January 1976, near Los Angeles, this town Redondo Beach, Chang goes to a seminar about this new company, Moss Technology, that is making chips that could be used in a video game system. And with some of the other people in preliminary design, like George Close and Larry Sims, they started to think about this stuff. And Larry Sims is still alive. We interviewed him and he said, we had this idea. Why can't we do this kind of thing where we connect it to a TV set, right? And do it with better graphics. And so Mattel brought in this guy, David Chandler, who had been helping develop the Minuteman guidance system, missile guidance system for a company called Autonetics, also in Southern California. He had invented an early video game. That's him sitting with it. It was a cocktail, what they call a video game, built into a table. At one of the very first game conferences called Gametronics in '77. So he was starting to get interested in this. And Mattel brought him in, and he's the one who was the main designer of that Intellivision thing that I showed you. He even wanted to try and make it into a computer. You can see here Intellivision fitting inside of a keyboard and a cassette drive that would actually turn it into a sort of computer. And there was some conflict because he did not have a background in toys, but he had this big idea about home computing and entertainment, and Intellivision was sort of part of that whole dynamic. And one of the people that they were working with one of the designers, David James, who's still alive, shared this document from 1976 where they were brainstorming. This is before Atari was released, right? Even the Fairchild Channel F. And you can see they're talking about a video game system, a console. He calls it Category 1 there. And then down below, Category 2, and you might not be able to read all this detail. It's okay. It's just cool to see the documents. He talks about calculator type games. You might remember those old calculators with the red, LED dashes that everyone loved. Maybe you could do something with that. They were talking about that in Mattel. And actually, because that was easier to do, they did that first. And so they created handhelds. You've probably seen pictures of these. You might remember them. And it was based on a 4-bit calculator chip that this company Rockwell had created. I won't go into it. I know it was nice handwriting. But these were a huge success, and they made millions of dollars. And that's what bankrolled Intellivision. Even though, as you saw from that picture, they had the Intellivision idea first. They started with this because it was smaller, it was easier to do, self-contained, like it says, and this is from the Sears catalog. Some of you might remember those. But even in order to do this, they couldn't do it alone. Mattel didn't have enough technical background. And so they worked with this company, APH Technological Consulting. And APH is named after the applied physics major at Caltech. When I told you about the Richard Cheng guy going to that hotel room and hearing about this new MOS technology chip, this group, APH, was there. And Mattel hires them to help them do this stuff because they can't do it by themselves. So there's this early collaboration that's happening. And this company not only makes software, but they make hardware. So for instance, they made this thing called the data widget, which allowed you to test your programs. This is an old ad of the data widget. I interviewed Shal Farley, one of the designers of it. He still had one. And this is a very early startup collaboration. You're absolutely right. And here is Shal with an actual data widget that he still had, which is pretty cool, that he showed me. So here they start making games. And because Mattel doesn't know anything about what to do, people in this APH company start making games. So for instance, So all 20 of the games that were originally released with Intellivision were programmed at that little company APH, which is up in Pasadena. Some of the staff there, like this guy Dave Rolfe, who we interviewed, who also created that operating system. There was a guy, Hal Finney, who actually is sort of famous in crypto circles nowadays because he was the first recipient of a Bitcoin transaction. He was a legendary programmer, but he started out doing this stuff 40 years ago. He's passed away now. But these folks were paid an hourly salary, like, whatever it was, $7 an hour, $5 an hour to create these games. They got no royalties, none of that. And because this was all people from Caltech, they would even hire college students over the summer, like this guy, Ken Smith, and they would just pay them a little bit of money to design a game because they didn't really even know. They thought of it as just programming back then, right? So for instance, Dave Rolfe created Major League Baseball. He coded the whole thing himself, did the entire thing himself, basically. Using a familiar idea, no one owns baseball. They did pay a little money, like $10,000 to Major League Baseball to be able to use their logo, right? The little Running Man image here, which Dave James created, the guy with that document I showed you, actually became the Mattel Electronics logo. So this was a very popular first game. And right from the beginning, they used this to try and go up against Atari because Atari was cheaper. It was $200 instead of $300. That was a big difference back then. It got to market first, and Atari always had like 70% of the market. So they hired this George Plimpton, who was a kind of journalist personality, to do all of these TV commercials, but also magazine ads comparing Intellivision to Atari, showing how Atari is so much better, the graphics are better, it's more realistic. And if you hear about console wars and Apple versus Windows and Sega versus Nintendo and Xbox versus PlayStation, well, that's all new. This was the first video game rivalry ever, was this rivalry with Atari, where Intellivision was the underdog, but they were using Atari's success, right, to try and piggyback on it. It was actually very successful. They would also try to use licenses to get ideas for games. So here's a beautiful hand-drawn document by David James where they were going to do a game based on Battlestar Galactica. They actually did a handheld game. They were going to try and do an Intellivision game, and the deal fell through. And so the Battlestar Galactica people said, no, we're not going to do this. But they already started doing the game. Hal Finney, the Bitcoin guy, was starting to do it. So they just finished it and renamed it Space Battle. And if you look at down there at the right, it's a little hard to see, but the little blue alien ships, they look just like the Cylon things from Battlestar Galactica. They didn't even bother changing it. They just changed the name. But it was still very creative. This is using only 4K. And one thing they pioneered in video game design was this thing called fields of play, where to the left you see there's like a strategy map and the enemy ships are coming in, the fleets are coming in. And then to the right is like the close-up where you control a cursor and you shoot the bad guys. That kind of moving between two fields was a hallmark of Intellivision game design. Atari couldn't really do it, and you couldn't really do it in an arcade where you only wanted people to play for a couple minutes, right? I'll show a couple other examples of that. Another example of a failed license. Here. Another example of a failed license. They thought they were going to get Star Wars. Star Wars fell through. And I'm sorry this is a little fuzzy because of it getting brought into Second Life. But I underlined there, it's a little hard to see. But this says trench game research proposal. Everything was handwritten, or so much was back there, which is amazing. And here, one of the APH designers, Tom Lowry, you can see his name up at the top. He says, we're going to do a game set on the Death Star. The license fell through. They made the game Star Strike. I can't show inside a Second Life. You know, you could go to YouTube to see a clip if you want to, but here's a famous ad they did. And so they didn't get the Star Wars license, but if you take a look, it's pretty close to Star Wars, right? IP worked differently back then. But they also did a lot of original games. So like, a couple of the slides got backwards, sorry. Oops, here we are. So a really interesting idea of an original game I played as a kid is this game Sea Battle, where you have this fields of play, you have a big map with enemy fleets and islands, and then you zoom in down to the right to try and shoot the other ships. Amazing game. This guy, Ken Smith, was a 20-year-old junior in college. They paid him $3,000, and that's all he ever got to design this game. That's going to come back to bite us when we're talking more about the learning to be a designer and what education means, because it also meant learning about the idea of the career of being a game designer, right? I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. So yeah, only $3,000. And he designed almost everything. But even in these early days, one thing we discovered in our research was there was more collaboration than people sometimes realize. If you go to a lot of websites about old video games, you will find that like this one person designed this game, this person designed this game, but that's actually not completely true. They were helping each other out and collaborating even in the very early days. So for instance, here is a document from Tom Lowry, and he's proposing some ideas for games. And if you look at the one down on the bottom, it says Frog Game, 4K cartridge, 1 to 2 players, a simple children's game. So he proposes this game to Mattel. And Mattel says, yeah, we'll do this. And they, at this little startup in Pasadena, they know how to program games, but they are not artists, right? So what do? They hand draw the graphics that they think they need, and they send it to Mattel and say, could your artists do it? And here it says like moving objects needed, a lily pad. They're giving some details about how it's going to look. And Karen Nugent, who was one of the early programmers, talked about how someone had to physically drive from Hawthorne, that's near the LA airport, up to Pasadena, and then they would code it, the pictures, and then drive it back. And it would sometimes take a week each time just to try and get the graphics to happen. It was amazing how much stuff happened with handwritten documents, because even doing word processing, they didn't want to waste the computing power to do that. So they're doing all of this, and Mattel needs APH, they collaborate with them all the way through the end, all the way till the crash. But they start to get worried that we really are relying on this other company for almost everything, this little startup. Like, that's a bit worrisome. So Mattel decides we're going to create our own inside group that's going to make games. We're going to bring it in-house, at least somewhat. So they create a game design team called Application Software, and they bring in this guy from England, Gabriel Baum, who we interviewed. He works for the Richard Chang guy. And the reason they hire him actually is when they interview him, because we talked both to the guy who hired him and to him, was that he talked about it's not just about code and engineering. It's about learning to be creative. And this image on the right is from a TV Guide article about these programmers, about how they're trying to brainstorm games and come up with games. Most of them, or a couple of my things are out of order. Wait, there we go. In order to get these people, these programmers, most were hired right from the LA area, right out of college. There was no game design back then. I mean, very, very little. There were the arcade games, but video game design, now my university has a game design major. That was not, yeah, Helena, that's true as well. And when Gabriel was interviewing these people, he hired people who their bachelor's degree was in Shakespeare studies, who played guitar, who did like medieval role play, Society for Creative Acronym. And this ad, if you look down next to the Mattel logo, Dennis Marchand, we interviewed him. He was like the HR head, the head of hiring. And this is an actual ad. And it's a little hard to read the detail, but the ad says, you can have fun here. You can have creativity and imagination. Come work for us. But they don't really talk about it in terms of game design. They're reaching out to engineers and technicians because that's the only language that they have back then. And so what was this like? It was hard. They, in some ways, half stress, half party is the way one person talked about it. Often late hours, they're in a big room full of cubicles. Sound familiar, right? I mean, 40 years later, you can see the influence. They talk about sneaker net, like going to the next cubicle, like I'm stuck, I need help. Can you help me out? There's a playful atmosphere, and pranks, but there's also a lot of deadlines, especially because back then, this is before the internet, right? More than 80% of video game sales happen at Christmas. If you miss Christmas, you are screwed. So you have to be on, the timelines were very different than how they are nowadays. And this image to the right, it's a little hard to see the details, but it is like a Mattel corporate thing about how to handle stress. And then one of the programmers who's passed away now, Keith Robinson, has written some hilarious comments on the side where, like, at the top it says, like, if you have to stay a little late, don't resent it. And then he writes on the side, Mattel propaganda, free overtime is good for you. And nowadays we talk about labor, the sort of danger of this idea that you're doing what you love. So you should work 80 hours a week. You should work on weekends because you're doing what you love, right? That is such an ideology nowadays in the technology world. And this is one of the places that really got started. Now, the arcades were around, but they're trying to invent all these interesting new games. How did they do it? They would have these brainstorming sessions. They'd go to a restaurant, they'd go to a park, they'd sit in a room, and they would brainstorm. And this is notes from one of those brainstorming sessions where it's people's initials on the side, where someone is saying, how about something like Lunar Lander or a party type game, charades, a strategy game, a maze, or, they're just throwing out ideas, brainstorming, right? Here's another example of a group trying to do educational games. And you can see they say Gala Affair at Barnaby's. Barnaby's was a restaurant close to the company, close to Mattel. So they're like, children could learn about gardening from a game where vegetables grow. Or you could do an economics game, right? Or an environment game. Like they're thinking about climate change, right? Talking about this stuff, trying to brainstorm games. But in some cases, one programmer would actually propose a game. So for instance, here's one, oops, wait, let me go back. Here's one that actually got created called Mind Strike, which is like chess almost, where the higher number things can move further but don't have as much power. David Warhol, who we interviewed, came up with it. And this is a document to his boss, basically saying, I would like to start developing this game, and here's how it would work. So it wasn't always a group thing. Sometimes people would do it, by themselves. They would try to come up with idea for a game. Here's another example, Connie Goldman, who was a very important early designer and also graphics artist. This is a game that did not get created, where she proposed a game where there's an angel trying to get to heaven, and there's like devils that try to like stop it. And the leadership, the marketing decided that this would be too controversial to the religious themes, so they passed on this one. But sometimes they would also work with licensing. They did the very first games based on the movie Tron. But another really great example is Kool-Aid Man, that was programmed by Mark Kennedy, who we interviewed. They did a deal with General Foods to create a video game based on Kool-Aid Man. And they held a brainstorming competition inside Mattel where there were like 15 different proposals. But they ended up freaking out General Foods because some of the proposals, as you see here, one of them, like Kool-Aid Man dies. Do you see there at the right? He says dead. So they actually, General Foods created like a 10 commandments because they were getting scared for the programmers, where they said, Kool-Aid Man cannot die. He cannot kill anyone. He cannot go empty. The kids cannot die. They came up with all these rules to protect their Kool-Aid Man. And the version that went out, it has these two kids running around inside of a house picking up packets to make Kool-Aid Man. It's not a very interesting game really nowadays. And Mark Kennedy himself admits it was not a very good game. But the story of it getting made is an interesting example of this push and pull between how to get, how to design a game when you have a license agreement that you're working with. So how did people at the very beginning even learn, educate themselves? There were official documents from like General Instrument that made those chips. Dave Rolfe, who I mentioned to you, programmed that operating system, did an amazing document called Your Friend the Exec that would teach you about that program. But also people were leaning over the cubicles, sharing ideas, and over time, they started to create their own documents. So to the right here, this is a handwritten document to help people remember how exactly the hand controllers work. No one had ever done that. And so they made it informal, just by hand. This guy, Bob Neustadt, who we interviewed, this is Bob Neustadt, created this document. He coded pinball that you're going to see in just a second, created this document to show people. There were also these little programs called Trivia and Killer Tomatoes that you could use. They were very, very simple. In fact, Trivia, it was originally Trivial. They shortened it to 6 letters. And Killer Tomatoes was because of that, horror movie. But it was a very simple game that was just a blank screen with like a thing running around and you could shoot basically. But it was a way to learn the basics of how to program and how the exec, that operating system worked, how Intellivision worked. And this was given to people when they came to, learn Killer Tomatoes with a later version of it. And this is some of the actual code from it. And make a simple game, and that's how you're going to learn. And over time, that became like a common language for learning how to do Intellivision games. And they would often take what they had used in that little practice game and actually take it into the games that they actually did. So Bob Neustadt, who did that picture of the hand controllers I just showed you, he was one of the main people who coded pinball. And it's a little hard to see here, but he gave us the code to pinball, right? We have all this code. And I put it in red. You can see at the bottom, it might be a little hard to see, but it says rewritten from Killer on October 5, 1982, rewritten from Trivia on 26 May 1981. He's talking about how they are reusing some code from those practice games inside of pinball. Now, as time progressed in terms of educating, they even started to make seminars where the programmers would get together and collaborate. Once again, talking about collaboration. Here is an announcement of a couple from February, I think this was 82. So Thin Ice, that was programmed by Julie Hoshizaki, one of the first female programmers as well. Mattel had a lot of female programmers. she did Thin Ice. And here you can see there is a support group where she's going to show what she's done so far. And everyone is going to help, deal with bugs. How is it playing? How is the gameplay working? So they would help each other out. And then the second one, you can see their assembly subroutine swap meet is sharing code. Hey, do you have a good code to make an explosion? Do you have a good code to make it look like someone's running? Let's share, right? How would they do that? So what did it, and I have about 12 more slides. So I'm going to wrap up in about the next 6 minutes. What was it like when they were working? So here is a hand-drawn map of what it looked like inside of Mattel. And these names are, most of these are people that we interviewed for the research. So what it was is they were in these rows in cubicles. And at each end of these cubicles, like you can see that first one is like 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, 7, 4, 8. Those 8 people at the end of the cubicle, there would be a PDP-11 mainframe computer. I'll type that in, right? Which is made by Digital Instrument Corporation or DEC. And then there would be a monitor. So 8 people would share one mainframe computer for coding the games. And then to test them, they would use that data widget that I showed you earlier. And if you see the places where there is a circled W, that's where those would be. And then if you look, I'll show you, let me show you this next slide. Here I circled. Down to the right there at number 50, there's a GDS, right? And then you can see these Ws. This is as they have to share resources. So the W stands for this data widget, right? Which I was showing you before. GDS means the graphics development system. There is only one surviving photograph of the GDS, and this is it, and it's not the best picture. It was destroyed, and this is the only known photograph of it. But it's a little hard to see, but basically there's a monitor, and then there's a row of buttons. It's almost like a light bright, if you remember what those are, like plastic buttons, and they're each for a pixel. And you would press it down to code your graphics, and then it would turn it into code on the monitor on the left. It was called the graphics development system. It was really clunky and really slow, and everyone had to share it. Everyone in the whole floor had to share it because, as you see here, there's only one of them. There's only one GDS. So what happened was a couple of the programmers started making development tools. They created a thing called Mr. Color, where it turned Intellivision into a development tool. This is amazing. So you can see how this keypad I showed you before with the overlays, now you can use it to create graphics and immediately see what they're going to look like. And nowadays, can you imagine using a Switch to code a game for Switch? Can you imagine using an Xbox to code a game for Xbox? Or even using Atari to code a game for Atari? You couldn't do that because all Atari had was the joystick, right? Usually. Here, because of the way Intellivision worked, you could turn it into its own development tool. And what this meant was that by 1983, Gabriel Baum and these people at Mattel could hire graphics designers who were artists but didn't know assembly language. They didn't know how to code, but they knew how to do beautiful graphics. And that was the emergence of specialization in game design. For the first time. Connie Golban, I was mentioning her earlier. She was a famous early graphics designer. She ended up doing a lot of graphics for people, but she was a programmer. She knew assembly. She knew all this code. But later on, they could hire people who didn't know how to code. It was the beginning of specialization in the video game industry, which was really interesting. Now, of course, they had management that they had to answer to, right? And so another part of this learning process was you start to get structure. And it's a little hard to see once again, this document, but up at the top, it says Baum Gabriel as vice president of this group. And then as they grew, there were up to about 80 programmers. They started to make these groups, group leaders, you can see, and they were under 2 main people, Don Daglow and Mike Minkoff. They even had baseball teams, the Daglow Decals because of the 10-bit thing, and the Minkoff Measures, which is the name of a test they would give people when they were trying to hire them. But these people who became leaders were all promoted from within. They were programmers who sort of moved up the ranks, but eventually you got these group leaders that were trying to help people meet deadlines. And they didn't code as much eventually. They were helping manage the people under them. You start to see a structure happen as things start to boom. Gabriel at the top is trying to protect them from the executives and the marketers way up high. And there was a complex relationship there. This is part of a satirical pamphlet that one of the programmers made, where he put little quotes with images from Dante's Inferno. And here it says, it may become necessary to restrict the programmer to the project as designed. And it's an image of the Inferno of someone being nailed to the ground. This is sort of how the programmers felt about the higher ups, because they would tell them what to do. But they also knew that they needed the marketers, because Mattel was legendary for their abilities in marketing. They were seen as the best out there in marketing. And if no one bought your games, right, nothing was going to happen. And so marketing would come and tell them, we need more space games, or there's an interest in this or that kind of thing. And so, you know, they worked with the marketers and collaborated with them, but there was some tension as well, as this image shows. And this would happen in the toy side as well, actually. This is something that was not unique to Intellivision. And then you also, in this time, saw the beginning of scheduling for game design. So this is we only have 4 or 5 of these. They had these documents called goldenrods, where they would track cartridge development by month. The black line is that something has been completed. Has the design been done? Has it been quality tested? Has the box been designed? Has it gone to manufacturing? And so they were starting to create this kind of workflow, especially in these early days where you had to make the Christmas deadline. So I only have 3 more slides. So I mentioned earlier, you know, that Ken Smith guy only got $3,000 for doing Sea Battle, because this labor was called programming. When we asked people, what did you call yourselves 40 years ago? They were programmers. People said they never called themselves game designers. They called themselves programmers. And I hire you to code Adobe Acrobat or Microsoft Word, or I hire you to code a game and I pay you $10 an hour. You know, I could pay you your salary. So, you know, Tom Lowry, who we saw his frog image, they did a really amazing Dungeons and Dragons game I played as a kid. And it has this fields of play, as you can see, where you have a world map. You're trying to get to this big mountain and you're going through lakes and forests, and then you have to go into these caves to get things like a key to unlock the gates. A couple people worked on it, but Tom Lowry did 80% of the work. He did almost all of it. And for all of that work, he was paid a one-time thing of $5,000. We know from internal documents that by June of '83, Dungeons and Dragons had sold almost 700,000 copies. Somewhere around $15 million of income for the company. And Tom Lowry got $5,000. And his name isn't even on it because they didn't want other companies to steal their talent. So his name's not even on the game. People got more and more unhappy, as you can imagine. And some people from Atari and Intellivision left those companies because Atari had a similar policy and created third-party developers. Because when you had the second generation, where for the first time you have cartridges separate from the machine, you get the first time the idea that you could have a company that only makes cartridges. You don't have to make the consoles anymore. So Activision, which you still hear that name, EA Activision, and Imagic, for instance, were founded around '82 by former employees of Intellivision and Atari who were upset about this. And right before the crash, at the very end, before Mattel went bankrupt, they created an incentive plan. This is the internal document that we found about it, where you would get royalties, 6 cents per cartridge, which to me doesn't sound like the most, generous, but part of the learning and the education is learning about video game design as a kind of job. That's not just, it's more like creating a movie or a musician creating an album. It's a creative thing that I should get royalties, right? And advance payments. So you see this at the very end. Yeah, the payment cap. Well, once again, and this was basically never done because in 1 month later after this, Mattel laid off almost everyone because of the crash. So concluding thoughts, during this time, video game design is emerging as a job. And there's education about how to design games, but also what does it mean to be a designer, right? The whole idea of video game design. And, there's so much I obviously couldn't talk about, but I hope I've given you a little taste about how, this huge project I did looking at the code, looking at the marketing, looking at the advertising, looking at how the console itself works, looking at the games from all those different perspectives can really give you a powerful way to understand what was happening and give you some interesting ideas about how this history is affecting our present day world when video games are a huge industry. And also, while Second Life is not a game, virtual worlds and online games are deeply linked. They share the same engines, Havoc and all that kind of thing. And there's a lot of games inside of Second Life, and many of the biggest virtual worlds like Fortnite are designed almost solely as games. So this history has a lot of interesting implications to the present day. Thank you so much. The book will be coming out in October. Because it's 400 pages long, it is going to be $60, but MIT is releasing it for free at the same time as a PDF. And this link takes you to the MIT website. There's nothing there really yet because it's just beginning. But by the time the book comes out in October, you can always get the physical, paperback book if you want, but you will be able to access the book for free from the beginning. And we're so thankful to MIT for doing that, because we really want people to be able to access this information. And the size of the book means it's a pricey book. So thank you so much. Yes, you can download it. You can't yet. They say it's coming out in the fall, right? We're doing the page proofs right now. So September, October, I'll let people know. But that website will be the website for it. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry I went about 10 minutes longer than I wanted to, but I can stay till 12:30. And I'm always happy to talk more about this. So anything at all that you want to know about this, about Intellivision, I'm happy to talk about it, and this idea of learning and education.
Thank you so much, Tom. Boy, did you bring back some memories. No, you're not 10 minutes behind. I was the one who was speaking to myself for the first few minutes. We do have a little time for questions, couple of minutes, and then we will reconvene at the back on the deck. Any quick questions?
And I think there were some in the chat as well. Someone asked favorite arcade game, and that's like your favorite food. How can you pick? But I grew up. I played Q*bert. I loved Q*bert. I loved Dig Dug. I mean, there were so many, and they did it in Intellivision. Dig Dug. Mook has an anecdote.
Yeah, Mook.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say about that is one interesting thing is, as you saw, Intellivision really started off with those sports games, and also I've only seen a bit of the Tetris movie. I really want to see it. They start off with those sports games or those strategy games like Sea Battle, but as time passed, they shifted to more and more arcade style games because the marketing people said that's where the money is. There's a lot of desire for arcade games. And by the time they got going, Atari had snapped up a lot of the best licenses, like Atari got Pac-Man, things like that. But Intellivision got Burger Time and did a very good Burger Time from Data East Company. And they got Tron. They beat Atari to get Tron and did 3 Tron games. But so shoot 'em up games, and also they did a very famous game called Astro Smash. That was actually sort of the first version of like esports, where they had esports competitions for it, and that was a shoot 'em up as well. ColecoVision did do a good Ladybug. ColecoVision came out a little bit later and it created a 3-way rivalry, and it was a real challenge for Intellivision, because then Intellivision could no longer claim to be the most advanced system. Because Intellivision had 8 moving objects, and ColecoVision, I think, had 16. It had more colors. It was a real, it was a big issue for them when ColecoVision came out.
Okay, I'm trying to keep up with the questions here. Some of these are just memory lane type comments.
Yeah, if it's a comment, that's great. I mean, feel free to put in your comments as well. I'm just trying to see if there's actual questions, but comments. How inside the virtual world's economics? I've talked about that in other research, but here I'm focusing on Intellivision. For this book, we stop at 1984. And like I said, the book's 400 pages already. So we had to stop then. So we had to stop by 1984. But yeah, for that, it was all about selling cartridges. And that was what they were trying to do. That was the name of the game. That's right.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, really
You
read
read
all
all
10
10
volumes.
Well, I had a question on how much you thought that game development influenced the development and advancement of TVs into smart TVs, let alone phones, and the development and reduction in size of processors for computers and laptops. It must have really been heavily influenced by the need to have something that could adapt or take on a game and render it effectively.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting. That is a great question. So part of the whole ideology or whatever marketing for Intellivision was that it was going to make TV intelligent. And back then, TV was a big deal, and people, common names for it was the idiot box, right? Or the boob tube. It was seen as a dumb, thing. Another very important thing is during this time in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the US, it was something like, I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 85% or 90% of households had a TV, but only like 10 or 15% had more than one. So TV viewing was a family affair and people were not looking at an iPhone at the same time, right? So if you were playing a video game on the TV, that meant that mom and dad were probably watching, right? It was a family thing, like that image that I showed, of the arcade comes home. I can scroll back up to it. And so that's an interesting difference from nowadays, right? And so part of the company's goal was that we are going to make television intelligent, and that was the whole, name. And it did sort of get that, ball rolling, that TV could be, it was a big push into back then what was called interactive TV. Interactive TV was a big concept back then. People were talking about it, but the most common technology was the VCR because you could record shows, but that was it, right? This was way more interactive than that. And so that is where they got that idea of intelligent television, of Intellivision. And just as a funny, side note, the head of Mattel Electronics early on in 1980 actually flew up to Silicon Valley to meet with Andy Grove and the other heads of Intel, because there's that picture of, right, the whole family was watching TV. I just put up on the screen because they realized that Intellivision could sound like Intel. And back in those days, things were more loosey-goosey around legal stuff. So they flew up there, met with the head of Intel, and just had a handshake. And Intel said, it's okay. You could call it Intellivision. All we ask is that you say Intellivision : intelligent television, and just put that afterwards. That's all. And so that's why if you look, let me scroll back to the picture of Intellivision itself. If you scroll up to the screen, you can see, I think, it says Mattel Electronics Intellivision, and then to the right, it says Intelligent Television, sort of fitting your point. It's a little hard to see, but if you zoom up with your camera, you might be able to see it there. That was because of Intel, to avoid any kind of lawsuit. But it was just done with a handshake. So you're absolutely right. This was in the air back then, was how to make TV interactive and what we would now call smart, right? The word they would use back then was interactive. And Mattel, this idea of intelligence was a new thing, right? That they were pushing, and that Intellivision would make the home TV intelligent.
Wonderful. Thank you.
This must have, wait a minute, Meryl. I was thinking about something too, Tom. This must have influenced the birth of, what was it, web TV? Remember that, where you didn't have to have a computer, you could get your emails and you could surf the beginning web on your television with web TV. So this must have had some influence on web TV's development.
Well, yes, and even before Intellivision, I wish I could put up new slides. It's just too hard to do right now. But even before then, things like, if you know what Minitel was in France, but there were also some early things of interactive TV, like a monitor, a home monitor, very early versions of the internet, teletext systems, thank you, Will, that were showing up. And Mattel made some early conversations with some of those companies. And David Chandler, so the guy who designed the Intellivision, who had no background in toys, this guy, right? When I said he had this idea of Intellivision sitting inside this thing called the keyboard component, only 400 of these were sold. He couldn't get it to work. But they were trying to do a next generation system like this that would precisely do some of those teletext functions that you could do. He talked about, Dave Chandler, we have documents where he says, I have the idea that you would play video games, but then you could also do your home finances or turn on your security system. He was talking about that in 1979, 1980. It's amazing. 1978. They were talking about that. And it was a big debate because the Mattel executives were like, this is a long way from Barbie. Like this is so far away from what we do, right? And there was huge debates in the company about that. But you are absolutely right that this was in the air. And there was a huge debate inside the company. And it was a bit of a fight between David Chandler and Richard Chang, because Chang came up from the beginning through the toy company and thought about entertainment and toys. Chandler came out of the military, but engineer and computers. And he had this idea, I say here on the slide as a basis for home computing, that Minitel stuff is exactly what he was interested in. And he actually had meetings with some of those early companies. Nothing ever happened. It fell through, but we have documents about those meetings. They definitely happened.
Okay, well, Tom, we want to thank you. Our time is up for the moment. Give you a hearty thank you for your presentation. The audience is invited to gather informally on the deck at the back of the venue to ask additional questions or to offer comments. Please note that the next installment of the VWEC Expert Series will be on Friday, April 12th at 1 o'clock SLT. A VWEC panel will review trends that emerged from the recent VWBPE conference. Finally, you can find links to our in-world calendar and related helpful information in the material that I will add to the text here shortly. And we can be reached through a variety of media. Once again, please see the text. So you're invited to step back to the deck where we will have an informal conversation with Tom until past the hour, and you can have virtual snacks.